how do we deal with the climate crisis at an accelerating time of accelerating impact at the same time that democracy is both beleaguered internationally and in the States, and also I think it's fair to say dysfunctional in the United States?
I think we work every day to build better democratic institutions. I'm here with a group called Climate and Democracy Institute. We joined the Athens Democracy Forum for this week, really with a hope and probably a prayer that we will be able to reinforce the institutions that have supported the United States really as a beacon for democracy for so many years and really for so many decades. And while it is stressed, and while we see evidence of backlash, even in our own United States, we have a belief that we can't do otherwise, that we have to be working at building democratic institutions in a positive and constructive way in order for us to really tackle climate.
So I think it became clear at this afternoon's discussion about democracy at a hotter time that democracy is the best way to address climate change, but also that it's not enough, and that it's such a big problem that it requires a great deal of cooperation, both within a country and then also internationally. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the specific challenges that we have at home in the US to enacting climate change.
Sure. So it's interesting. We have challenges at the federal level. We have a Congress that is about to shut down the government. That doesn't bode well for us as a sort of functioning democratic institution or democratic state. But we also have states in the United States that have shown a great deal of positive development. And I just very quickly will make this case. We do see backsliding. We see backsliding among states in the United States on climate and on democracy. We saw 19 states pass voter restriction laws after January 6th of 2021, the insurrection at the Capitol. We saw 19 states. Interestingly, those same 19 states are sort of hostile toward climate policy. But we have 23 states that have done a great deal to pass climate-friendly legislation with limits, with clean energy goals, with different kinds of tax credits to add on to what's at the federal level. And in those states, they cover about 70% of all the population in the United States. So there's a battle for it inside our own country, but there's some positive news to emerge from it that has to do with a federal government where states can be very active. In a state like California that's 40 million people, and the fourth biggest economy in the world, according to California, that they actually can move in a way that other states will follow and demonstrate leadership that's global.
I'd like to talk about one specific example, not to get too into the nitty-gritty, but I think that it shows some of the challenges of addressing climate change when you're dealing with a federal system like our own, when you have interests in both the private sector and the public sector. So you're from Colorado, where you're looking at ways of new energy, new sources of wind power, of solar power. When you have states where, for example, you have sources of solar power that is intermittent and wind power, how do you then get states to cooperate and then bring power to states that have more resources to those that have less resources, while also dealing with infrastructure challenges to the grid, for example?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and the grid is absolutely part of the conversation when you're talking about the power sector. But we shouldn't be undone by that question, right? Because in Colorado, our major utility is going to reduce its emissions by 85% by 2030. They're bold, they're out there, we have a lot of renewable power, and so the important thing is to ensure that that gets done while we work on that last 15%. Some places it might be 10%, but not to be undone by the fact that we don't know yet. We really don't know yet, and I facilitated a conversation with a group of utilities from around the country and some environmental NGOs and environmental justice leaders, and we never answered the how to get to zero question. There are some cost barriers presently to the technologies available. There's political barriers, to be sure, but we believe that building democratic institutions is absolutely tied to this question of how to bring people along. The other thing that's been mentioned throughout this conference, and that was mentioned by both of our speakers tonight, is equity. And the socioeconomic reality needs to mirror what democracy promises. And I think, the Biden administration has absolutely made a commitment to that. We need to all do the same in terms of commitments to people that felt left behind by democracy at this stage.
We know that some of our most vulnerable populations in the United States, the people who have fewer resources economically, are also those who are most threatened by climate change. And there's a parallel, obviously, on the global stage, which we talked about earlier today, which is that the poorer nations often feel that they are suffering at the, where nations that were able to go through industrialization and modernize earlier, rely on fossil fuels, they now have to bear the brunt of those costs. How do you address those inequalities both at home and abroad?
Yeah, there's such an important parallel, and that's why, as an American, I feel pretty good about this conversation going forward, because I believe we get the justice issue here. We would never make someone, we really abhor the idea of someone paying for a crime they did not commit. That's actually kind of what happens if you have a very large carbon footprint and somebody else is bearing the brunt of your bad conduct or your conduct over time. That's a justice issue for us, and why we should pay attention to all of the nations with small carbon footprints that are feeling it first and worst. And I do think Americans, if given that narrative and explained that, would get that as an environmental or a climate justice issue.
I'm glad you brought it to the individual lesson, because I want to talk about another challenge there. Earlier today, there was mention of the fact that Rishi Sunak in the UK has pulled back on some of the regulations to help address climate change. And the justification, one of the justifications he used, was using the language of democracy. And he said that he believed that he needed to allow people to make a choice. Do we have the luxury of that? How do we combat that kind of message? Because it sounds good, but we know that greater action is required of everyone.
Yeah, he did that during Climate Week. It was such a mistake in my mind, because I feel like what happened there was the conservatives had a special election. They campaigned against some of the goals that are in the climate plan. They won the special election, and for a short-term electoral gain, he extended the long-term commitments. And I just think that's like the worst thing you could do right now. You have to demonstrate political courage. You have to demonstrate this willingness to avoid short-termism, as a friend of mine has coined at this conference, and really be about long-term. And to say that it was to give people a choice is to really, in a sense, abdicate his own need to demonstrate leadership in a democratic society, in a democratically elected society, that you are willing to pay the price to do the right thing around climate.
So short-term thinking, obviously, is a major barrier to what is a very long-term problem. In the United States, of course, that's exacerbated by an electoral system and financial systems that go along with that in terms of fundraising by our 2, 4-year, 6-year election cycle. So how do you overcome those short-term thinking and those practical barriers to enacting long-term policy change?
Yeah, I think inside of our electoral system, campaign financing is a big evil. I believe that the way we redistrict oftentimes can be organized in a way that takes people of color out of the mix, or they have lost the proportionate voice that they deserve to have, those kinds of things. So we have to, again, look at this as how to build democratic institutions. In some respects, we have to figure out how to circumvent the money, and that only happens with citizen participation. The only way you're going to make a dent in trying to circumvent the impact of money inside of politics. But I think it's the right question, Pamela, and I don't think I have a perfect answer to this. That's partly why we see, I think, kind of the dangerous place we're in the United States, is because we have things that have threatened over time our democratic institutions and make it difficult for us to attack climate change. But I really do believe the discussion here about citizen participation is something we should pay attention to as an antidote to the vast amount of money that really can pervert political outcomes.
So we know that having citizen action and participation in addressing this crisis is crucial. How do you get that at a time when there is a pervasive and often growing distrust, not only of institutions, but of science, where science has become politicized and polarized?
And I would add, especially at a time where there's media that reinforces the anti-science message, the anti-democracy message.
Not the New York Times.
What's that?
Not the New York Times.
Not the New York Times at all.
Yeah.
But there are media outlets that are fairly popular in some parts of America that sort of reinforce it. So that makes the job even more difficult. But again, I've heard it, in this conference, it's about leaders listening, leaders giving citizens the ability to participate, leaders, empowering citizens. So if you just think about environmental justice, several states in the United States have now stood up offices of environmental justice or also just transition. And what those are about are going into communities that feel very left behind and saying to those communities, you're going to have a voice in how we build an energy economy in America that responds to climate. I can't tell you that's going to be easy. It's going to be a bumpy ride. There is a trust issue, absolutely. But if we are to do it, we will do it only because we are willing to listen to people in communities that have felt very left behind.
Well, we've talked about a lot of big, intractable, and complicated problems, and it's kind of hard to end on a positive note, but I would like to do that. So can you give an example of how you think democracy in the United States has effectively addressed climate change, either under the Biden administration or specifically in the work that you've been doing in Colorado?
Yeah, we are very heartened. In part, our work is bipartisan. We work with Republican and Democratic governors. There were 5 Republican governors before the 2018 cycle that had passed clean energy legislation, in part because of their concern around climate. So we read and hear a lot about what's happening in Congress, but we don't necessarily pay as much attention to states like Maryland or Massachusetts, Illinois, Michigan, Nevada. All Republican governors, all passed clean energy legislation that made a very significant difference. I run a legislator academy for Democrats and Republicans from around the country, and we get Republican legislators in there, and it's not always the climate issue that resonates with them. It can be the economic issue. And the good news is there's a lot about the economic issue that has turned very positive in the last 5 to 7 years, and we make that case. And so we are seeing a build out. We're seeing the shutdown of the coal-fired industry in America. We're seeing our emissions reduction come down. We're turning now to the transportation industry and trying to look at the transition inside of the transportation industry for the same thing. And there are places where we see it happen in a bipartisan way, and we see it happen in an equitable way, where marginalized communities, tribes, Native American tribes, indigenous people are being brought along in this new economy. And I see it sort of, all over. There are a lot of patches where it's not happening as big, but, it is happening, and it's something we can take heart in.
All right. Thank you so much, Governor Ritter.
Thank you.
Thank you remotely to Secretary Kerry.